got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It's Monday, December the 1st, 2025. Hasn't begun necessarily as a particularly happy December, given what's happened in Venezuela. We might talk about that later in the conversation. But exactly 4 weeks ago, a certain Dick Cheney died, former Vice President of the United States, once the great bête noire of the American left. Now, people are a little more ambivalent about him, given his and his daughter's hostility with a certain Donald Trump. One man, I think, who may have an interesting take on Cheney and post 9/11 America is my guest today, Joshua Colangelo-Bryan. He has a new book out, Through the Gates of Hell, American Injustice at Guantanamo Bay, particularly focused on the consequences of 9/11. And I'm thrilled that Joshua is joining us right now. His day job is at Human Rights First, and he has committed his life to human rights. Josh, has Dick Cheney, do you think, got a rather free ride from progressives in the context of his own, if not crimes against humanity, certainly rather mixed record on human rights in post 9/11 America?
Well, I think there's probably something to be said for not disparaging those who have recently passed away. And of course, we're looking at everything through the prism of an administration that flouts the law in a way that even the Bush administration might have been a little bashful about. Having said that, Vice President Cheney, his counsel, Donald Rumsfeld, people in Rumsfeld's office were certainly more than instrumental in the creation of a disastrous detention operation at Guantanamo, not to mention a disastrous war in Iraq, among other things. So as a policy matter, it's hard to look back on the Cheney years and have a warm spot, particularly if you're interested in the rule of law, human rights, and that sort of thing. But even if you're interested in just cohesive, thoughtful national security policy. Having said all that, the fact that, even he believed Donald Trump was going too far certainly says something about the Trump administration.
Your book has a pretty dramatic title. Josh, I'm not sure if you chose the title, Through the Gates of Hell, American Injustice at Guantanamo Bay. How did you get involved in Guantanamo and the detention there? Tell me your story of not just Guantanamo, but perhaps your lifelong commitment to human rights.
So starting in the late 90s, I began working in Kosovo, doing first humanitarian aid, and then a little bit later working on war crimes cases with the United Nations, which certainly was a formative experience when it comes to human rights issues, international law, and the like. After doing that for a few years, but still being a relatively junior lawyer, I decided to head back to the States and get some basic litigation training at a commercial law firm. That's where I was in 2004 when the Supreme Court issued a ruling saying that, contrary to the government's position, even foreign detainees at Guantanamo Bay had rights they could assert in court. And I got a call from a friend asking if we would be interested in representing people there pro bono. It seemed like a great opportunity to do nuts and bolts litigation, but in the context of really important international and domestic law issues. And most fundamentally, it was appealing because at the time, the government was saying that because it was detaining foreigners in Guantanamo, there was no jurisdiction to hear their cases. And even if there was jurisdiction to hear their cases, nobody had a single right they could enforce in court, including the right to be treated humanely. That just sounded wrong to us as lawyers on a most fundamental level. And so really, as a matter of principle, we decided to get involved in the case and ended up being one of the very first little groups of lawyers to head down to the base in the fall of 2004.
Josh, this notion of Guantanamo as hell, you're not saying not the first or probably the last human rights person to make that comparison. Is your story, though, in Through the Gates of Hell, is it appalling because of the innocence in particular of some of the characters that you were working with, one in particular from Bahrain? Or is it just the profound injustice of Guantanamo, of what it was like to be kept in this prison, whether or not you were guilty?
People who believe in the rule of law will rightly say that everyone is entitled to be treated humanely, that nobody should be arbitrarily detained, let alone, potentially for their entire lives. So those principles, which were completely ignored at Guantanamo, should always be observed. I think it highlights the practical necessity for those principles when you have people who in fact are not even alleged to have taken any action against the US, but who end up at Guantanamo. And in fact, that was a majority of the detainees. So even if you're someone who says you don't care about human rights, and if a few people have to be harmed to keep us safe, what rationale would there be to mistreat and detain people that not even our government accused of doing anything against us? It really just highlights the critical need for rights to be respected.
I'm sure you've heard this argument many times before, Josh. Some people might say, well, the inhumanity of 9/11 was so astonishing, so breathtaking, that anyone and even remotely associated with that plot or sympathetic to the plot deserved the same kind of treatment. Is that a legitimate argument?
I understand the emotional appeal of that argument, particularly as a New Yorker. It is not in any way a fair statement of the law, nor is it how America had dealt with armed adversaries before. I mean, it's hard to think of a more inhumane batch of people than the Nazis, but that didn't mean that we stopped observing the laws of war entirely when we were fighting the Nazis. And certainly, I think anyone would be hard-pressed to say that Al-Qaeda is somehow worse than that, even if arguments about, perhaps equivalence could be made. But the bottom line is, you don't get to ignore the law just because somebody else has. And again, the whole line of reasoning is predicated on the idea that somehow you have grabbed the people who are responsible for 9/11 and you'll get revenge against them. The majority of people in Guantanamo, forget 9/11, weren't even accused of taking action against the US. So why should there even be a base emotional satisfaction in abusing someone who's not the person who actually harmed your country to begin with?
I want to come back to the conditions in Guantanamo in a few minutes, Josh, but you mentioned the Nazis. Often they come up in these sorts of moral equivalent conversations. I'm not sure if you saw the new movie Nuremberg, which is also about human rights and bringing injustice into the court. Can we historicize human rights? Could we argue that international human rights, where you've dedicated your life to, you've spent all sorts of, you've invested time in suing Turkey, you've written about the current crisis in Syria, so you have a very global dimension on this, that the global narrative on human rights was ushered in at Nuremberg, and that perhaps in a way these are the two bookends, Nuremberg and Guantanamo, at least in terms of US involvement?
Certainly, human rights as such is a concept that began to get formalized, as you say, after World War II, and in direct response to those unspeakable atrocities. Formally speaking, we could also talk about the law of war, which is in theory distinct. That also was very much further developed following World War II and those atrocities. So, I think at times people imagine international law as being something that was created just to bind our hands and to keep us from making ourselves safe. In fact, it's something that the US was very heavily invested in creating in response to horribly brutal acts that were perpetrated, in a practical response to things that human beings were doing that no reasonable person would have ever wanted to see done again.
We could spend lots of time criticizing George W. Bush, Rumsfeld, and even Cheney, even though he's been recently departed. But did something in a broader historical sense happen between Nuremberg, an American commitment to international human rights, and the United Nations, and 2001? Was there a slow descent from a commitment to human rights under international law to what took place at Guantanamo? I mean, obviously you had a complicated American history in those 30 or 40 years between the war and 9/11, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. But for you as a human rights lawyer, are there moments where you saw, if not the inevitability of something like Guantanamo, the likelihood of it?
I'd like to say that I'm prescient. I guess I'm not particularly, because the way I observed the period leading up to 9/11 was that there was a greater emphasis on human rights. We saw international courts created to address terrible crimes that had been committed in the former Yugoslavia, crimes that had been committed in Rwanda. If you go back some time before that, we saw the Europeans promulgate a convention on human rights. We were looking at the development of the International Criminal Court. So I think if there is any overarching narrative, and it's always hard to draw them, there was an increased recognition on the essential value of trying to protect human beings from the worst forms of government abuses. When 9/11 happened, perhaps it's unsurprising given history, but we saw a real break with, for example, Vice President Cheney openly saying, well, we're going to have to go to the dark side, by which I think he meant that we had really been coddling dangerous people for too long in the name of human rights, but now the gloves were off and we were going to do whatever we had to do to protect ourselves. Unfortunately, beyond the moral failings in that, as a national security matter, the policies that were enacted did nothing to protect us. In fact, to the contrary, in many respects, created greater danger.
Why did it happen, though, after 9/11? I mean, you had the terrible bombing in Oklahoma City where hundreds of completely innocent people died. We've done shows on Terry Nichols and some of the other people involved in that great crime. Why did it happen after 9/11? Is it the foreign element? I know that one of the central characters, or many of the central characters in your narrative, are from Bahrain, which most Americans don't even know where it is. Is it the religious element, the foreign element? Obviously, Islam, which Trump himself now seems to be playing that card more and more.
I certainly think that if you look at Oklahoma City, some 8 years, my math may be wrong, 7 years before, and compare it to Guantanamo, compare it to 9/11, the outrage around 9/11 undoubtedly in part was due to the larger scale, but it also must have had quite a bit to do with, as you say, this being an attack by foreign Muslim terrorists, as opposed to people who you might describe as good old boys gone awry. And then when you're talking about the policy response to that, well, it was very easy to demagogue all Muslims or all Muslim men or Muslim men of fighting age in a way that you couldn't do with American terrorists. That demagoguery was, I think, indispensable for the diminution in rights that the U.S. government effectuated with respect to anyone who it might call the worst of the worst, regardless of whether the person had done anything to warrant that description.
Let's talk then about Guantanamo. You spent some time there, not as fortunately not as an inmate, but as a lawyer. What was it like? How many people were there, and how brutal was it? It's the whole point, and correct me please, Josh, if I'm wrong, but isn't the whole point of Guantanamo that it lay outside the US?
The government's theory at the time, and again, this was in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and Vice President Cheney talking about going to the dark side, was if you held foreigners as enemy combatants outside sovereign U.S. territory, then no court would be able to hear any claims that they might bring. People could be interrogated with absolutely no constraints. And also, if you put it at Guantanamo, it's a secure location. That theory fell apart legally in 2004 when the Supreme Court said it may not be sovereign U.S. territory, but we control it completely, and therefore even foreign detainees there can bring habeas claims. When we went down in 2004, there were still 600 plus detainees there, down from a high in the 700s. And we were representing 6 people, none of whom had been accused of crimes. And in fact, very few of whom had been accused in any substantive way of doing anything hostile to the U.S. I was a bit nervous going into my first meeting with a client there. Not many lawyers had been down before. We didn't know much about our client's background or temperament. And I was a bit anxious about whether I was going to be sitting down with some hardened terrorist. But I walked into the room, met with my client Jabber, who was the first person I saw there. And
this is Jabber Mohammed, the Bahrainian.
Correct. As soon as I walked in and saw this very emaciated, diminutive man, he looked up, gave me a very warm smile. He was shackled to the floor, but he sort of tried to get to his feet so he could shake my hand. And we ended up in a very easy, personal conversation. I mean, within minutes of sitting down together. Now, obviously, none of that proves that someone isn't a bad guy, but it certainly assuaged my anxiety that I was going to be sitting with someone who might try Al Qaeda.
Although interesting, I mean, as you said, I'm not sure if you've seen the Nuremberg, the new Nuremberg movie, but it's about the way in which Goebbels successfully, in some ways, managed to convince some American lawyers and psychologists that he wasn't quite as evil as he clearly was. But that's another issue. I want to come back to Jabbar Mohammed in a minute, Josh. But coming back to Guantanamo itself, I mean, how bad was it compared to a standard prison? Was it just a place where guards would beat up inmates? Would they be starved? Would they be waterboarded? Would they be tortured in other ways?
There were all manner of physical and psychological abuses perpetrated there, which I suppose is not surprising when you start with the premise that you are going to be holding the worst of the worst at a prison beyond the law. You tell guards and other staff that they're responsible for detaining the people who, put 9/11 into operation. And so as a result, there were many examples of pure physical beatings. There were examples of bizarre and illegal interrogation techniques, like female interrogators putting red dye on detainees and saying it was menstrual blood in an attempt to keep the detainees from feeling that they could pray and rely on their religion for strength. There were hunger strikes during which people were violently tube fed multiple times a day. There was very serious use of isolation to house people without human contact. So it was quite different from any prison you have in the US, given that it began as a place with really no standards at all, that had people held in outdoor cages with banana rats and scorpions and other creatures coming in and out. I will say that the worst of it occurred before lawyers began to go to the base in 2004. And I don't think that is at all a coincidence, because really the people there had been utterly voiceless until attorneys began to arrive in small numbers.
Who is accountable for this? For these, I guess, crimes against human rights? I know you write extensively about Rumsfeld, Cheney, Bush. I mean, who knew about this, or was it just kind of anarchy there, and the guards were able, if they were in a bad mood, to behave in any way they wanted?
There are a range of dynamics at work. One is that the civilian leadership in the Pentagon created a set of interrogation techniques that were permissible to use, all of which we would undoubtedly consider illegal if they were ever used.
Is that you? Is it John Yoo? Is he involved with that?
He was involved in drafting a legal memo that said, among other things, if you weren't experiencing pain similar to what you would with organ failure, then you weren't experiencing torture. He said that if the president ordered something to be done effectively, that couldn't be torture. And all of this underpinned an interrogation program that two psychologists came up with. And bizarrely, they based their interrogation program on a military training that is designed to help service members resist interrogation by the Chinese or the Soviets historically, who were interested in getting false confessions. So the entire program is premised on interrogation techniques used by our Cold War adversaries, not to get legitimate, actionable intelligence, but just to get people to say whatever it is that their captors wanted.
like a new slant on the Manchurian Candidate. Let's come back to your clients and what later turned out to be your friends from Bahrain. Tell me about their background, what they were accused of doing, and what they actually, in your view at least, did or didn't do.
So all 6 clients had Bahraini citizenship. One client, Jabber, also had Saudi citizenship. Bahrain is a tiny island nation that sits just off the coast of Saudi, for people who are not studying their Persian Gulf maps all the time. Our clients,
and a rather unpleasant state. I mean, certainly in terms of its absence of human rights, for better or worse.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Our clients were accused of a range of actions in terms that were so vague as to be essentially meaningless. For example, one client was accused of meeting a certain man, and it was said that that man later fought on the front line against the Northern Alliance, which was a U.S. ally in Afghanistan. If you break it down, our client supposedly met a person who later fought against the U.S. ally. How that justified our client being held indefinitely at Guantanamo, I certainly never understood. They were also accused of things that were really irrelevant. For example, Jabber was accused of having gone to Afghanistan in 1989, which I realize sounds suspicious to the average American. What he explained was that in 1989, after the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, which they did in part because of the assistance we were providing to fighters there, the Saudi government was running essentially school trips so people could go to Afghanistan, which was relatively safe, and see the result of this effort that the Saudis, along with the US, had funded to kick the Russians out. And so he went for a long weekend as a 16-year-old. Now, how that made him a combatant against the US, well, just defies logic. But these are the sorts of things that people were accused of. And I should note, those accusations only came after we convinced the courts to tell the government that it had to try to justify why people were being held. So this was several years after our clients were first detained that the military cobbled together these assertions, which for the most part, even if you accepted them as true, didn't make our clients combatants.
Where was Jabbar Mohammed arrested?
So he had been in Afghanistan monitoring a construction project that had been funded by someone in Saudi when the U.S. bombing campaign began there. He fled. He made his way to the Pakistani border. He asked Pakistani border guards to bring him to the Bahraini embassy, which they promised to do. But almost immediately, he was arrested, put into a Pakistani prison, and then later transferred to U.S. custody, almost certainly in exchange for a bounty, which, as Donald Rumsfeld so poetically put it, the U.S. was dropping flyers offering bounties like snowflakes in Chicago in December. So any Arab man the Pakistanis handed to the U.S., that was a payment to Pakistan. So we're almost certain that's how Jabber ended up in U.S. custody in Afghanistan. And based on all accounts we have heard, if you were an Arab man in U.S. custody in Afghanistan, that was a one-way ticket.
So that was a one-way ticket to Guantanamo and not to just some other camp somewhere else?
So interestingly or terribly, civilian leadership in the Pentagon told the uniformed military not to hold the battlefield hearings that the military had long conducted to determine if it was holding a soldier or just a goat farmer. So there was no process applied to any of those people in Afghanistan. And as a result, not only do you have the terrible human consequence of innocent people being shipped to Guantanamo, but you have a situation where even early on in Guantanamo, the commanders there were saying things like, sometimes we just got the wrong folks, because no process, anyone handed to you goes to Guantanamo. Obviously, there are going to be mistakes.
Surprise, surprise, especially given the Saudi authorities' association and highly controversial association with bin Laden and many of the other plotters. So your book, Josh, is about your relationship with some of these people you were defending and the development of a kind of friendship. And lots of books written about relationships between lawyers and people in prison. Is the fact that these guys were innocent, what does that add or subtract from the narrative? In a way, wouldn't the narrative be more compelling if they were actually guilty?
Well, I was writing nonfiction, so I had to
yeah,
play the cards
I'm not suggesting you should lie, but
no, of course. I mean, I think that's a judgment that a certain reader might make. For me, though, while, as I said, we started the case really as a matter of principle, it just didn't seem right that people could be locked up forever without a hearing.
To put it mildly,
the fact of developing personal relationships and coming to care personally about people, and then seeing that the government had no evidence to suggest that they were bad guys, made the situation almost cease to be a matter of principle and made it one of a very personal nature. And I think we would have done our duty as lawyers regardless of what the clients were credibly accused of. But when someone who has become your friend is being held potentially forever in solitary confinement and subjected to bizarre and disturbing interrogations, and there's no legitimate basis to hold him, well, that's a very animating scenario to find yourself in as a lawyer. And it certainly pushed me to be actively engaged on the case in one way or another almost every minute of the day.
Did it make you embarrassed as an American to see such a, what seems to be, at least in the way you're telling it, a self-evident example, not just of injustice, but of injustice layered on injustice, given the nature of conditions at Guantanamo?
Sure, although it was a little over a year before we first went down that the U.S. invaded Iraq. So my embarrassment level was already quite activated. This certainly didn't help that, but I was, well aware of the fact that most of the world rightly was viewing our response to 9/11 as being somewhere between immoral, misguided, and disastrous. And that was certainly a feeling that I made known to our clients.
Did these guys, you got them finally, you got most of them off. I know Jabbar Mohammed was let out. Did they get an apology? Were they recompensed or compensated in some way for this injustice?
No. And the few efforts that people made to force some kind of compensation, were summarily thrown out. What Jabbar in particular got right before he left was a form he was asked to sign saying that he would not rejoin Al-Qaeda or the Taliban to fight. He pointed out to the colonel who gave him this form that it didn't really make sense because he had never done that before. The colonel said, he understood, but it'd be a really nice gesture if Jabbar signed it anyway. which he did, given that his priority was to get on a plane out of there. So that was the only item he received from the U.S. government to mark his departure. And I think it's safe to say that nobody who was at Guantanamo, no matter for how long or how innocent, is ever going to get a penny from the U.S.
It's certainly a moral stain. What is the lesson then? You're not the first person, Josh, to write about the injustice of Guantanamo and what conditions were like there. What, very briefly, would you like people to learn from Through the Gates of Hell? Why should people read this book?
At the core, it's a story of a personal relationship between an American lawyer and a Saudi Bahraini detainee that developed in maybe the world's most notorious prison. I think it is instructive at this point, particularly because Jabber was one of the worst of the worst. He was in a group that was fully vilified by the U.S. government, and he had his rights trampled on because of that.
Right, just to be clear, he was part of the worst. I mean, he was considered the worst of the worst.
He was called.
He was completely innocent.
And nonetheless, he, like everyone else there, indiscriminately was called the worst of the worst. It is very reminiscent of what we are seeing today with the Trump administration, essentially branding all immigrants or any undocumented immigrant as a criminal, despite the evidence to the contrary. And with that vilification, denying them legitimate protection of the law. I hope that the book is one small example of how getting to know a human being who is part of a group that's being demonized will almost inevitably lead you to question the basis for the demonization of the whole group, because the individual human beings are not going to match that description. I mean, we're literally seeing the Trump administration today call immigrants the worst of the worst and send them to Guantanamo.
Yeah, and of course, this all came out of the shooting of two National Guards in Washington.
Well, even before, and now we're going to see that on steroids if it wasn't before. Exactly.
Do you still have a relationship with Jabbar?
I do. We have been in touch throughout. It was, in fact, several months ago, my teenage daughter had a high school project on Guantanamo, and she interviewed him since I had suggested she go right to the source. So we have been in touch. I have been to Saudi to visit him. He's got 4 children now. I held one of them as a newborn when I was there. He still makes all kinds of jokes at my expense about my being too serious and too stingy.
How old is he now?
He is 52.
So he was in there when he was in his 30s. And has he forgiven America? I mean,
he, beyond what I would ever be capable of, talks about focusing on life as it restarted out when he left Guantanamo, and about how he always wants to look forward. He says that whenever he is thinking about Guantanamo, he tries to remember the instances, and there weren't many, but there were some, when guards showed him unexpected kindness, which he has always said was more meaningful to him than anything else. So to a really remarkable degree, his focus is not on the bad things that happened, but on the people who made it a little bit better and his life now. I mean, if you asked him, he would never have said he blamed all Americans for what happened to him, as opposed to people making decisions. And certainly now the thrust of his existence is about his daily life in the future.
How's he viewed in Saudi? Is he well known? Is he a celebrity of some sort?
So at this point, he has a fairly low profile. I certainly don't think that the Saudi public at large views people who were at Guantanamo as necessarily being bad guys, because there's enough awareness of what the reality was there. Interestingly, the Saudi government, which, as you said, is not a protector of human rights, created a fairly progressive rehabilitation center that people returning from Guantanamo spent some time in, just to adjust back to normal life. I think it was very helpful for people like Jabber. If only we could get the Saudis to show one iota of that compassion for someone who speaks out about the prime minister, or about the lack of respect for free expression. But obviously that's another story.
Another story, another book, another show. Josh, final question. As I said, you are one of the top lawyers at Human Rights First, so you're very much concerned with human rights law. You talked about the meaning of your book, this new book, in terms of what's happening in America, this sort of collective guilt, supposedly, at least from Trump's point of view, of Afghan and other immigrants, other Muslim immigrants. The headlines today, though, are about a different kind of human rights crisis, the indiscriminate, it would seem almost assassination, at least some people believe, of Venezuelan sailors of one kind or another. All the headlines from CNN to the New York Times, even to the Wall Street Journal, which tends to be a bit more conservative about this second strike on alleged drug boat. If these Trump principles of justice, and I think that's probably, it's not the right way of describing it, but if Trump's strategy was used in America, then I'm guessing they would have just assassinated Jabbar, whether or not he had a trial or not. I mean, I mean, it's obviously very troubling, and we've spoken about the troubling nature of Guantanamo and all the rest of it. But how much of what's happening today, in terms of particularly this Venezuela case, do we see a new chapter in the abuse by the American administration of human rights, of simply assassination, guilt, not just guilt by association, but then no trial and just killing people?
Well, we saw in the war on terror, which is a term to use carefully, that the U.S. government repeatedly was taking the position that it could use lethal force against anyone, anywhere, thousands of miles from a battlefield, just as long as it called the person a terrorist or a combatant. The seeds of what we are currently seeing, I think, can be found in those earlier operations. I mean, there's no legitimate argument that we are in a state of armed conflict with guys on skiffs that may or may not have drugs off the coast of Venezuela. So there's no legitimate argument that you can use military force in that context, where at most people are committing a criminal act. The fact that we're going to see the former president of Honduras, who himself is guilty of terrible drug-related crimes, pardoned, underscores that there's no legitimate factual basis for this approach, or any principled strategy that's being pursued here, as opposed to, once again, vilifying, I guess, anyone in a boat off the coast of Venezuela as a high-level drug trafficker, and then engaging in the ultimate denial of their rights by killing them, including, it appears, after their boats have been disabled.
There you have it. Through the Gates of Hell by Joshua Colangelo-Bryan, American Injustice at Guantanamo Bay. Very troubling book, but also an optimistic book in its narrative of friendship between an American lawyer and an innocent Bahrainian in Guantanamo. Congratulations, Josh, on the new book, and keep doing your good work at Human Rights First. We need lawyers like you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.